Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the world of SAP, Microsoft and the world in between. Let's start with the SAP area. There I do not have too much there. So there is one blog post that I would like to highlight, and that's from Carlos Rowan around the topic of SAP Event Mesh and how to set things up if you are in a multi-tenant scenario. So if you want to use a multi-tenant application and make use of the SAP Event Mesh. And the runtime that he uses is the Cloud Foundry runtime. So if you are working in that area, I think that blog post is super helpful, especially because from my perspective, multi-tenant setups are always something that you have to wrap your head around, and there is not too much great documentation out there, but this one really helps you a ton. With that, I'm already through with the news from SAP. I have two more blog posts from the broader SAP community, but they fit better to the developer experience area, so I put them there. Then let's switch to serverless, and what a shame, only one news this week around serverless. There was an Azure Friday episode around the new offering that complements or enhances Azure Static Web Apps that I have also presented a few weeks ago, around the enterprise-grade edge. So if you think about using that feature functionality, if you would like to know what's behind that, what do I benefit from if I use that, then this Azure Friday session gives you a very crisp overview what's hidden behind that new feature. And with that, I'm already through with serverless and switching to containers. There is one blog post which is very interesting from the PayPal engineering team talking about scaling Kubernetes. And they scale Kubernetes to quite some extent for one customer, namely to 4,000 nodes and 200,000 pods. And this blog post guides you through what the engineers at PayPal learned on that journey, how they did the performance improvements, the tuning with respect to the Kubernetes control plane, and what was their takeaways from there. So really very interesting blog post around that topic. Then several announcements of new bits and pieces that came out this week. First things first, Ranger Desktop is available in version 1.0. If you have not heard about Ranger Desktop is an open source app for desktop Kubernetes and container management. It's provided by Ranger Labs, so basically by SUSE, and it helps you with just basically setting up a very lean Kubernetes cluster on your desktop. It's available on Linux, on Mac, and on Windows. And it's cool. It's just cool. So it gives you really a super small, super fast Kubernetes environment on your desktop. With Windows, it's WSL2 backed, so it's fast as hell. Spinning up a Kubernetes cluster with Ranger Desktop, I think, is minute, something like that, and everything is running. So everything I do locally when dealing with Kubernetes, I use Ranger Desktop. So I really like that one. And now the first stable release is out. That's cool. Then a new release from Dapper is also out. It's version 1.6 with several improvements, and a lot of components have been moved to stable candidate. So if you're using that one or planning to use that one in production, I think that's definitely worth taking a look at. There are also some new capabilities, and be aware there is one component removed from the release, namely the Cloud State Store Alpha component, which is no longer included. Honestly, I don't know why, but maybe not too much support. I have referenced the Dapper 1.6 release notes within my show notes, and there is also a community call that I've referenced that, of course, also took into account the new 1.6 release around that topic. So if you like to watch that one, there is of course more information around Dapper within the community call, but that's also one important piece of the story. And then also another component that I like has gotten a new release, namely the HTTP add-on for KEDA. And that's now available in version 0.3.0, which has several breaking changes and a lot of other changes and improvements that have been listed in the release notes that I've referenced in my show notes. So it's not a new version of KEDA, it's a new version of the HTTP add-on, which is separated out and allows you to scale your workloads within Kubernetes based on HTTP triggers, which is, from the architectural perspective, a bit of a different story than all the other scalers that are available with KEDA, because you have to have some interceptors in order to get your grip on the HTTP workloads that come into your cluster. With that, let's switch to DevOps. What's new there? First thing that came out this week is a new release of Git. So it's now 2.35. That's out, and I've referenced the announcement blog post with all the highlights from this new release. So what's new, what's improved, and so on. So if you're interested, then that's the place to go. Then there is also a new feature available on GitHub. Namely, if you're using discussions, you have now an additional tab on the insights area of your repository, which gives you some community insights like contribution activity, new contributors, and so on and so forth. So quite interesting insights, how the interaction with your repository is going. I did not look if the GitHub API already reflects this new functionality, but I would guess so. So you should also be able to drag that out on the API way. Then 2 blog posts by a regular guest now on this NewsWrap, namely Marcel L. This time not in the serverless area, but this time in the DevOps area, talking about automating password rotation using GitHub and Azure. It's a 2-part blog post around that topic. I think super important from the area of security to do regular rotations there. And this blog post, in the usual super cool quality that Marcel has, guides you through that topic, how to set things up for yourself in order to enable that. And then another nice blog post from the area of DevOps, namely how to trigger service notifications from Azure DevOps or from GitHub using Azure Logic Apps. So another scenario that I think could not be stressed more, namely combining the options that you have within a platform like GitHub and combining that with serverless offerings like Azure Logic Apps and Azure Functions in order to automate things and in order to make your life easier. And especially Azure Logic Apps are an option that are easily applicable to such scenarios, for example, like service notifications. And as usual, this blog post guides you through how to set things up. And then last but not least, from the area of DevOps, a blog post by GitHub, which is a complete series around OWASP security topics. So a series on the OWASP top 10 proactive controls, that's how it's called. And this edition goes around secure database access. So that's really an interesting topic, and definitely something to take a look at, especially if you're working in the area of DevSecOps, how it's called, or in the security area. Then some news from the, broader, let's say, Microsoft area, namely from the hybrid world. Microsoft launched this week the landing zone accelerator for Azure Arc enabled servers. So Azure Arc, as you know, is the service that's enabling to manage your Kubernetes workloads wherever they are, be it on premise, be it on AWS, be it on Google, be it on Azure. So you have one central control plane and can then manage all those clusters and also inject data services and application services there. And now the Azure Arc enabled servers got added to the Cloud Adoption Framework. So basically all the typical topics have been covered within there that come along with the Cloud Adoption Framework, like identity access management, network, resource organization, all the governance topics, costs, and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, in order to make it even easier for you to get started with the topic of Azure Arc, there is an Azure Arc box that I've also referenced within the show notes. It's called Jumpstart ArcBox 2.0, which allows you, if you have an Azure subscription, to deploy kind of a sample setup around Azure Arc with the best practices embedded in there, supporting the Azure Resource Manager for the deployment, supporting Bicep, of course, and Terraform. And there's also, I think, as a default storage or data service, there is the SQL managed instance embedded in there. So that's really something that gives you a super quick setup with Arc managed service. So that's really cool. And another blog post that came out this week, which is really also an interesting read, and that's around distributed denial of service protection that Azure provides, and what they saw at Azure during the last 2 quarters of 2021. So what was the attack trends? What number of attacks did they face? And that was quite an amount. And also what attack vectors have been used and how all things happened there, and what Azure did in order to mitigate that attack. So a very, very interesting topic, which also clearly shows the power of the managed offering that you have there. I mean, for sure, not only in Azure, but I saw that blog post, and that's really interesting read. And then another topic that might, struck some of us, called How I Got Pawned by My Cloud Costs by Troy Hunt, and Microsoft MVP. Yeah, who had a little bit of a surprise in the bill that he received for December 2021. And this blog post guides you through, first of all, how he digged into the root cause for getting such an unexpected high amount of charge that he had on Azure, and also how what he put in place in order to mitigate to not let that happen again. Very interesting, very important read from my perspective. Yeah, with that, let's switch to the world in between SAP and Microsoft. And there is, as every Saturday, of course, an edition of the SAP on Azure video podcast, and this time with 2 guests, namely Matthias Klein and Takayuki Hoshino, talking about database migration options. So how to get your databases to Azure, including S4HANA, ECC, and so on. So, of course, interesting topic as more and more customers are moving to the cloud and deploy their SAP workloads there. And then another blog post, of course, also from a regular guest here, namely Martin Pankratz, with a very, very nice scenario around integrating SAP Cloud Portal and the Launchpad service into Microsoft Teams. And not only integrating them, but also using single sign-on in order to have a seamless experience. This blog post guides you through the setup there. Basically, the setup to integrate things into Teams is not that complicated, but what's the fun is, of course, the single sign-on part that gets described in detail. So what do you have to do within Azure? What do you have to do within your cloud cockpit and your settings with respect to enable a seamless flow and have the SSO in place. The blog post focuses on the cloud-based services, but there is also a section at the end of the blog post that guides you through the important SAP notes when you have a self-hosted Fiori Launchpad. So I think that's a very cool scenario and a very, very valuable scenario. And yeah, as usual, great content by Martin. Yeah, with that, let's switch to the area of learning and events. So first of all, there is a documentary that was published this week around Kubernetes. So how the journey of Kubernetes started. So how did Kubernetes get his feet onto this earth? It's a 2-part series, and the first part came out this week, so looking forward to the second part. It's just 25 minutes, and I think it's well spent 25 minutes. Then another thing that I really want to highlight is a video by Golo Roden from the NativeWeb GmbH around the topic of WebAssembly. And it has the title WebAssembly verdrängt Docker? Fragezeichen. So does WebAssembly or is WebAssembly the successor of Docker, and Docker will vanish from the face of this earth? And I think that's currently really a discussion that's going on, and it's, from my perspective, super annoying with respect to what's possible at the moment with WebAssembly. Now, this talk is really great, and big thanks to Golo Roden for this very objective, very clear, and very well-structured talk around WebAssembly, what's behind WebAssembly, what's possible with WebAssembly, what's the difference to Docker, what's the difference to Kubernetes, and all that in 24 minutes. And also giving an outlook where things might move to, but very objective, very clear statements around what's possible with WebAssembly. And little spoiler, as of today, WebAssembly will not replace Docker with the functionality that it has. But, well, I have a lot of discussions going on in that area, and they really should all watch this video in order to have the same point of view what's possible with WebAssembly. Now with that, let's switch to another meetup that came up this week that was founded, namely the Azure Cloud Native meetup in Newcastle, Great Britain, founded by Richard Hooper. Again, another meetup around Azure Cloud Native. I think super valuable because the folks in Great Britain are super active in that area. And there is already a first event coming up on the 22nd of February. So if you're interested in Azure Cloud Native, then I think this meetup group is definitely worth joining. Then another event that I would like to highlight from the SAP Open Source webinar series around open source, of course, called Navigating Open Source Risk, with a guest named Dawn Foster from VMware. Yeah, I think that's worth watching. Also, I personally do not like the title. It's about talking about the wide variety of risks that come along with using and contributing to open source and how to mitigate that. I mean, open source has some relatively clear rules, what you get and what you do not get. And well, I think companies abused open source to some extent for quite some time. And now with Log4j, they got aware of some points that they did not respect. And that's why I'm not really happy with the wording risk. But nevertheless, I think there are some important points that you can drag out of that talk that will take place on the 16th of February. Okay, now with that, let's switch to developer experience and how to get better in development. And there I have a quite wild potpourri of topics. First of all, a blog post by Luis Frese around how to be better at Twitter. So not just tweeting things, but really using Twitter as a channel to engage and build a community. And that was really super interesting. There are quite some things in there that I did not know around the area of media, like a Twitter card validator, around the topic of analytics and advanced search. There is an advanced search at Twitter. I didn't know about that. So obviously I'm complete newbie to Twitter, but that blog post really helps you a ton. Then another thing around knowledge management. And I think that tool came up by Mark Duiker, also Microsoft MVP and founder of the Azure Functions University. And that tool is called Foam. I referenced the GitHub repository in the show notes. And it's a tool in order to facilitate your personal knowledge management built on Visual Studio Code and GitHub, and combining those things in a very, from a first glance, very cool way. So if you are struggling, and let's be honest, who isn't, with personal knowledge management, I think that tool is definitely worth taking a look. It's in an early stage, so it's currently in a rapid development, though I guess a lot of things will change, but I think definitely worth a look. And then, as promised at the very beginning, 2 blog posts from the SAP community, but talking about developer topics that have nothing to do with SAP products. First one is picking up the current discussion around Docker. As you know, at the end of January, the new Docker licensing kicks in, which means if you're using Docker in a company, you have now really to pay for that, Docker Desktop. So you need a license, and that costs something, and yeah, that the usual discussion starts, right? And there is this blog post that I've referenced in my show notes called Replacing Docker with Podman as your local container engine. So if you're using Mac, then that's definitely a very nice alternative, because it's super easy to install and it has exactly the same CLI commands as Docker. So you just have to set an alias from Podman to Docker. And you can even keep all your scripts running as they have been with Docker. As I mentioned, when you're running on Mac, if you're running on Windows, well, it's not that easy. But at least one advantage when you're working on a Mac. No, just kidding. Yeah, so if you're standing in front of that decision, do I have to switch the container engine? I think that's definitely worth taking a look at. And going one step further, also a super interesting blog post, or blog post series even, by DJ Adams around dev containers and how you can leverage dev containers in order to improve your user experience with tutorials. I think super important topic and a super variable topic when you think about samples, about tutorials, and there is always the first section, hey, please set up tool A, B, C, D, and then continue and configure here, configure there. And this might run into conflicts on your machine or not, or you have a problem here or there before even starting the tutorial. And with development containers, you can, of course, overcome that. And this blog post series guides you through the details around development containers. So that's really cool. As usual, by DJ Adams, you learn a lot when walking through that. The first 2 parts of the 3-part series are already out. So if you are thinking about using dev containers, then that's definitely worth a closer look. Now with that, I'm at the end of today's session. I hope I had some news for you. Was a bit of quite a wild potpourri today. But with that, I wish you a nice Saturday, a great Sunday, a successful next week, and we see you again next Saturday. Until then, bye.